domestic real consumption of manufactured products prior to 2000 was less. The growth rate was less than for services. That's not been the case since 2000. It's actually been growing faster. And that's consistent with there being a surge of low-cost imports, increasing consumer demand in this country. Okay. Finally, let's think about productivity growth. Productivity growth without computers is not much higher or only somewhat higher than that in private industry. There's a very nice paper by Martin Bailey and Barry Bosworth, written a few years ago, that showed that once you took out computers over the 1987 to 2011 period, productivity growth was the same in manufacturing as it was in private industry. Now, flip that around. If productivity growth is the same, then for this most of manufacturing as it is for the private sector, then it can account for none of the relative employment declines. I do want to say that I've done alternative calculations with different data, and I find it doesn't, productivity is not the same, but it does account for the slower output growth, does, again, in this accounting sense, make up most or account for most of the relative employment declines. The point, though, that I want to make is that there's just no prima facie evidence for the productivity growth, for the automation narrative that productivity growth caused the employment declines in manufacturing. Okay. Understanding the causes of what was going on really requires a good look at why output growth for most of manufacturing was just plain slower, a lot slower than it has been in the private sector overall. And I'm not going to weigh in on that per se. But before I move on to some research evidence on that topic, I think it's useful to just pause and take a look and think about what productivity measures. Another criticism that I have of much of the discussion that takes place over automation is that automation, productivity growth is often equated with automation. It's just assumed that that's what's happening. Productivity growth measures many things. Here I'm really referring to labor productivity growth. It's picking up many different things, including automation. We've already seen, for example, that product improvements in computers and semiconductors caused tremendous productivity growth in that industry, and by extension, in the aggregate manufacturing statistics. That's not automation, okay? Also, one often sees a rapid increase in productivity or rapid productivity growth during major periods of restructuring, as we saw in the early 2000s, okay? That isn't necessarily an automation of what's going on. In fact, one would expect, for example, if on account of increased imports, international pressure from manufacturers in other countries, there was a decline in the number of factories. The first things that would be pushed out would be the most labor intensive. And that's going to result in a mechanical increase in productivity, measured labor productivity growth. Okay? So international trade can actually cause competition, can cause a sort of a sorting out of what's made in here, a change in the production, and lead to increased productivity. Another thing that can be happening is that with kind of globalization, the stages of production that occur here in the United States can just be changing. In the paper that I wrote for this, I gave some nice examples from actually a case study by Thomas Holmes of the furniture industry. Much of the particularly home furniture industry was decimated in the early 2000s. Entire segments went out of business. And what remained, much of what was produced here was fundamentally altered. For example, in upholstery, the very labor-intensive cut and sew aspects of that were offshored to China. and minor assembly continued back in the United States. That's going to result in a measured increase in productivity growth that doesn't have to do with automation per se. It's also been found that international competition may spur investments in automation. And in that case, kind of the direction of causality is a little unclear, because the competition from overseas can spur manufacturers in this country to increase investments and automate faster than they might already otherwise have done so. So the bottom line is that productivity growth does not per se cause employment declines. The strong argument that automation is primarily responsible for employment declines and both relative and absolute employment declines is largely based on descriptive evidence. And to really understand what's going on, we need to look at research evidence. And that's what I'm going to very briefly turn to now. There's been a significant and growing body of literature that in particular has focused on what's happened with the precipitous decline in employment since the 2000s. Exchange rates, industry subsidies, corporate taxes, tariffs, non-tariff barriers, and the like can all affect the relative competitiveness of manufacturing in the United States. And globalization may reduce domestic manufacturing output growth through imports. And a lot of the focus has been on sort of looking at the growth of imports, particularly from China. But we should also remember they can also operate through slow export growth in exports. Companies may choose to close factories in the United States and move them to Mexico or to Ireland or somewhere else. Or they may just choose to expand their production overseas. Much of what multinational companies, when they manufacture overseas, they often are manufacturing primarily for export markets. Some of that may come back to the United States, but by no means all of it. And I mention that because we don't capture that dynamic very well in the statistics. So it can be a bit hard to study. Before I sort of say a few words about the research literature, I really want to emphasize that no single study captures all aspects of globalization and its effects on manufacturing employment. Okay? There's weaknesses, there's big holes in the literature. There probably always will be. But collectively, the research findings point to large adverse effects operating through a variety of mechanisms. One of the most widely cited studies by Otterdorn and Hansen concludes that about 25% of the decline in manufacturing employment can be attributed, in the 2000s, can be attributed to the growth of imports from China. A completely different study, using a different data and methodology, looks specifically at changes in trade policy after 2000, causing an increase in imports from China, and also finds very large adverse employment effects. Interestingly, the sets of authors on these two papers have recently looked at the impact of imports from China and on other things, and have concluded that they have led to declines in production, investment, and patent activity in the United States, which can, of course, over time, have spillover effects on employment. One study, the final study that I'll highlight, and there are others that I'm not going to cover, I don't have time, looks actually at an appreciation of the dollar, a large appreciation of the dollar in the early 2000s on the decline of manufacturing employment, and can account, depending on specification, it can account for roughly half or even more of the decline in manufacturing employment. The reason I like this paper, I think it's important, is that it's not just looking at Chinese imports, it's looking at all effectively it's capturing imports and exports, the effect of this exchange rate appreciation on both. One of the very interesting findings from this paper also is that the job losses from a temporary exchange rate appreciation tend to be permanent. That is as if an exchange rate appreciation induces firms to invest overseas or whatever, the structure of production shifts globally, you've got those sunk cost investments. And when the dollar returns to its original level, it's not necessarily going to be the case that those jobs will come back. Okay, so it's a different, often you hear the story, the jobs aren't coming back because of automation, but there's another dynamic operating too, which is that once you lose it, it is hard to get it back because other countries develop expertise, there's sunk cost investments and the like. Oftentimes we want to say that, well, if this particular study explains, say, a quarter of the decline in manufacturing employment, 3/4 is explained by automation, but that doesn't follow, okay? And it turns out that several studies have tried to look specifically in the 2000s at the effect of automation, specifically investments in IT technology, on productivity and employment declines, and have found none. Okay. One is by Acemoglu and others in a sort of companion paper to their China paper, Otterdorn and Hansen, look at industries experiencing increased competition from China, and again find that it led to significant employment declines. But they also, in parallel, looked at industries susceptible to computerization of routine tasks and found that while it changed the composition of jobs within the industry, it led to no employment declines. In a much publicized paper, working paper that came out last year by Acemoglu and Restrepo, they found that industrial robots have the potential to cause large dislocations to workers, but that's in the future. So far, the number of industrial robots that have been invested in can account for no more than a trivial share of the employment decline in manufacturing. And then finally, I'll just mention what I think is some related literature, which is that several studies actually have found that the rise of markups in the 1980s, since the 1980s, and offshoring of labor-intensive processes account for the rise of capital's share in the economy and the decline of labor share in the economy. And in other words, it's not capital investment per se. It's these other things, rise in markups, offshoring. And that sort of stylized fact is inconsistent with there being a large technology shock causing the employment declines in capital share. I'm going to just close with a few thoughts on sort of why manufacturing matters. People sometimes may think, well, manufacturing employment is now under 10% of the economy. We shouldn't worry about it so much. But there's been a lot of domestic outsourcing. Half or more of the employment used in the manufacturing of products actually is employed outside the manufacturing sector. Also, it has very large spillover effects on local and national economies, so that you get typically multipliers of manufacturing employment of orders of magnitude of 2 or more. And one of the most robust findings in the economics literature is that plant closures and mass layoffs have large, adverse, lasting effects on workers and communities. Okay. Workers, on average, experience large and very persistent across decades, earnings losses on average. Some do fine, but many don't. And the size of the shock matters. Large adverse shocks can send regional economies into a downward spiral and depress regions for decades. We've known this for a very long time, and it's been documented in a better way recently in the literature. The collapse of manufacturing employment, while not the only factor behind the woes in labor markets in the United States in the 2000s, has certainly contributed to declines in employment rates, especially among less educated men and women. Now, we have a relatively low unemployment rate today, but we still see in the form of very weak earnings growth and very low labor force participation rates among the less educated, sort of greater structural problems in the economy that, at least in some way, are related to the decline of manufacturing employment, and there's been evidence on that. Okay. Also, as I mentioned, the loss of manufacturing production has led to the loss of research and development, which has longer-term implications for the health of the U.S. economy. So, to conclude, my main point is that claims that automation primarily caused the relative and absolute decline in manufacturing employment are just simply, at this point in time, not supported by the evidence. I'm not saying that automation played no role, right? Certainly automation is happening, but there's no prima facie evidence, nor is there evidence for the 2000s that a big surge in automation was the primary cause of what we've been seeing. Studies do find trade played a significant role in manufacturing employment declines in the 2000s, but again, I want to emphasize the research is incomplete. There's big holes in the data. Foreign competition does spur some investments in automation, and here that direction of causality is ambiguous. And the precipitous decline in the 2000s has had very large adverse and lasting effects on workers in the economy. And this, I'm not going to talk about trade policy, but this obviously raises questions about policies that may have triggered the sudden shift in global structure of production. I am guessing that Carolyn and Josh will weigh in on it, but thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Dr. Susan Hausman from the Upjohn Institute. And now we'd like to welcome Dr. Carolyn Freund from the Peterson Institute for International Economics and the World Bank. We'll ask each of the discussants to stick to about 7 minutes. Thanks.
Thanks. It's my pleasure to be here. Let me see if I put a PowerPoint here, if I can get it onto the screen. Is someone doing it from there, or? Okay. It's this one. Yeah, I did it in PDF. And then I think we can put it into view. So, you know, let me start by saying I agree with most of what Susan said, and I think she gave a really nice presentation. I think I'm going to quibble about the size of automation and skill-biased technological change and demand shifts and things like that versus trade. But I do agree that, especially in the 2000s, increased imports, you know, especially from China, played a role in the decline in U.S. manufacturing. I do want to take a step back and just remember why we like to trade, because when you just focus on manufacturing, you can ignore that part of it. The main reason is actually their consumer gains. So consumers gain when you go to the store and prices are lower. That's a real income gain for people, and especially for people who are the most vulnerable, the poorest people who spend a really large share of their income on goods. So I don't think we should forget about that when we talk about this, because while there are the workers in the manufacturing sector, there are also all the people who work in the service sector, actually the majority of Americans, who are benefiting enormously from this, and especially some of the poorest. And if we do want to think about the loss in jobs from manufacturing, the right policies are probably about training, adjustment, et cetera, as opposed to restricting trade. And then finally, this was a really special period. It was a period when China was running, a current account surplus of around 10% at some point, and the US was having a big consumption boom. So I think we have to take macro policies into consideration, that in some sense we drove this ourselves, not to do with trade policies, but to do with our policies that discouraged savings primarily. And then finally, in terms of just a broad overview, let's also not forget that 500 million people were lifted out of poverty in China from the early 80s since the early 80s until 2010 or so. And part of that was because of productivity improvements there, reforms there, and trade. And that's another bonus of global integration that we don't want to forget about. And some would also argue that integration, talking with other countries, business links, et cetera, have supported a long period of peace. So just to think about those as an overview. In terms of the quibbles with this paper, one is, I think, demand matters a lot. And it has to do with the size of the economy. And I'm going to go back to this kind of relative productivity hypothesis that Susan talked about, that productivity of manufacturers increases, but how many TVs can you have? How many cars can you buy? And that's going to put a constraint. Demand is shifting towards services as countries get richer, and so we just can't expect jobs to be coming from there. I also have a quibble that I've seen this before. It's been a common thread in this literature of let's take out the computer sector and show, it's nowhere else. Well, if we're going to take out one sector, we should take out some other sectors too, because now we're weighting it towards the sectors that had the lowest productivity growth, since we're taking out the high productivity growth one. And I'm going to show you some data that would matter as well. And finally, I'm going to talk about just some other things like macro context and other nitpicks one could have with the data besides the computer price index. So first, this is the alternative picture that people show. Instead of looking at the number of manufacturing jobs, let's look at the share in employment. And there, this period of rapid decline is not there. So it's been kind of a steady decline in manufacturing employment. And the difference has to do with the fact that during the early period when manufacturing growth was stable, so the left picture's pretty much the same picture that Susan had, where you do see the precipitous decline in manufacturing employment, part of it was because productivity was increasing, but demand was too, as workers were coming on the labor force, overall income was going up as a result of that demand, as well as there being plenty of workers to hire. In this later period, if you look at the working age population, it was much more stagnant. So the manufacturing sector is competing with other sectors for employment much more, which makes it more difficult to maintain employment. And also there's less of a demand boost for all those goods that they're producing. And here's what the technology looks like. And I just put a few sectors here just to give the idea. If we take out computers of some other sectors, actually if computers were on this chart on the left of labor productivity, it'd be way off the scale. It's at like 11, where this scale in productivity growth is much smaller. So you'd get the flat lines that Susan showed for other things that computers just dominate. But there is a difference even within some of these other sectors, and what you really see is that even primary metals, machinery, transport equipment, et cetera, had much higher productivity growth than our services, than hotel and food services, truck transportation. Wow, I have 1 minute. So let me just quickly go through the rest. And you can see it in prices as well, that the prices have fallen much more for goods than for services. So that's where the consumer gains come in, but also this leads to a shift, in part because of this demand for services, the prices are rising there, but the share of what people are spending as countries get richer, they spend less on goods. And because prices are falling, you spend less on goods. And you can see this very clearly in this shift towards consumption of services. This is where, in this picture, you can see, again, I'm trying to distinguish between industries, that if we want to take out computers and electronics, we should take out probably apparel and textiles as well on the other side, or something of equal size. So the size of the bubbles are the size of the sectors, and it shows the employment change, which is kind of exaggerated here because of the scale, versus the output change. They both are, going to roughly 0.8. But the point being that, one, all sectors experienced a decline in employment. It wasn't specific to the declining sectors because productivity was rising in part. In some sectors where output and employment declined, it was probably more related to trade. I'll concede that. But we also saw really big productivity gains, especially in transportation equipment. And I think that should be recognized. It's a huge sector that had a big productivity increase, not as big as computers, but big. And finally, the other issues that I wanted to talk about. One, and I said it at the beginning, the macro context matters a lot. Average unemployment in this period was very low. The consumption share of GDP was increasing. If you look at imports to GDP, it looks very much like other countries over this period. What's really different is exports to GDP. So something was wrong in the US that as we were as competition was affecting our manufacturing industry, we weren't growing our exports in the same way as other countries. And finally, if we're going to nitpick the data and just take out one sector and say, look, then there are other nitpicks as well. Transfer pricing and profit shifting matter a lot. There's incentives out there to over-invoice imports as a company, or imported inputs, which then pull your profits down and your taxes down, and to under-invoice exports. And some have estimated this alone as half of the US trade deficit. And then the price index on autos and machinery probably understates advances. I lease a car, and I have not had a price increase on my car, and yet I keep getting tons and tons of more features, since 2000, or for the last 8 years or so. So there's something going on that if we're gonna argue about the price index on computers, then we should probably look into some of these other price indexes that may understate real increases. And I'll wrap up there because I think it's time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carolyn. And next we will hear from Dr. Josh Bivens from the Economic Policy Institute.
Sorry, I'm going to try to find my PowerPoint. There we go. Okay, thank you. So I'm going to say a couple words. I'll start by saying I think Susan's paper and presentation are really thought-provoking and admirably careful in their claims about what economic analysis can really precisely say about the various facets of globalization and manufacturing job loss. And so I'm going to take my job to be a little less careful and basically say it's true, we can't be super precise about this, but we can look at some sort of broad brush data and try to bracket the effect of rising trade deficits on manufacturing employment. And it's going to be really hard to escape the conclusion that those effects are pretty large. So before getting to the precise question at hand, I also have two quick asides. First one, the extent of globalization's pressure on the living standards of American workers is not equal to its effect on manufacturing employment. We could have balanced trade, and there might still be large downward wage pressure on non-college wages in the US economy. And in fact, I think these wage effects cumulatively are probably quite a bit larger in terms of the losses they put on American workers than the damage done by manufacturing job displacement. I think the manufacturing displacements, they're the most acute damage felt by individual workers for sure. It is much worse to completely lose your job than to have your wage sort of chronically pushed down over a long period of time, but the wage effects are really big. And so that's one aside. Second aside, trade deficits can certainly have effects on overall employment, not just manufacturing employment, particularly when the economy's growth rate is demand constrained. I mean, yes, when the economy is unambiguously at full employment, trade deficits essentially just change the composition of employment, pushing jobs out of tradable sectors into non-tradable. I would argue we have not been in an unambiguously full employment economy for a long, long time. The graph I'm showing you here is basically interest rates. And if you just concentrate on the far right of that graph, we've had interest rates essentially bumping right above zero for about a decade. And the standard story for how trade deficits do not harm overall employment is, yes, the trade deficit reduces employment all else equal, but you get this big inflow of capital that pushes down interest rates, and that creates jobs in the economy. Well, pushes down. Capital inflows push down interest rates. Yes. We do not need lower interest rates in the US economy right now for job growth. We need something else because we've had zero interest rates for essentially a decade. And so I would argue that countervailing effect of capital inflows in pushing up jobs over the past decade has been extraordinarily weak. So trade deficits can have influences on overall employment for sure, not just manufacturing. And then finally, this is boring, but it's really worth saying. If we are going to tolerate a really large trade deficit and we want to be at full employment, then we have to tolerate a really large budget deficit or a really indebted household sector. Like there's no getting around that fact. And so someone who wants to say we're at full employment and we have a large trade deficit and that's fine, I really don't want to hear them talking about how we need to reduce the budget deficit. Unless you think there's a one-way causality from budget deficit to trade, but there's not. So let's get to the real question at hand. Trade deficits and manufacturing job loss. This, I realize, is just exactly the same graph that Susan put in hers. This is, to me, looking at the right, it's the implosion post-2000 that, to me, is the really interesting thing here. It's one thing to say manufacturing's employment share has gone down for a long time. It has. The overall level was extraordinarily stable for about 35 years, between 1965 and 2000, and then it just falls off a cliff. And again, my contribution to sort of dismissing the really easy, it was all automation explanation for this. If you look at productivity growth between 1965 and 2000, when manufacturing employment was really stable, and you look at it post-2000, when it's not stable at all, it's really hard to see much difference there. Productivity growth was really fast in manufacturing from 65 to 2000, and yet we did not lose 33% of the jobs in a 16-year period. And so basically the second column is basically hours, that's employment in the industry. That's the annual loss over that time period. So the way I match up these two things, I think at best a quote-unquote acceleration of productivity of 0.2% in the latter period. Maybe it gets you 10% of the explanation for what happened post-2000. I think even that's actually a little high. So can we be more precise than this? If we don't think it's productivity, what can we say that it is? And I, in the interest of meeting my 7 minutes, will skip one slide. Focus on the bottom expression here, and I'll tell you what that means in 1 second. But the logic is going to be the changes in manufacturing employment are basically just equal to the change in domestic output, how much stuff factories in the United States are producing, minus the change in productivity. So if you produce 4% more stuff, but productivity rises by 4%, employment doesn't change at all. You didn't need to hire anyone else to produce that extra 4%. Your existing workforce just got more efficient. But one thing that we often miss is that change in output is a function of essentially two things. I mean, a lot of things, but two things. Domestic demand, what do US consumers actually want to buy from the manufacturing sector? And then the wedge that trade deficits introduce between that domestic demand and domestic output. So maybe US consumers want to buy $1 trillion worth of manufacturing output in a given year, but if on net, 200 billion of that is satisfied by imports, you're going to see a wedge between what US consumers want to buy and what is actually produced by US factories. And so that's what I'm trying to get at with this last expression with the little hats over it. That L with the hat over it, that's basically employment in manufacturing. And that's going to equal the growth of domestic demand, that's that YD with the hat, plus the change in the wedge introduced by the trade deficit, that's that little d, and then minus productivity growth over that time period. And this is going to let us do a sort of very simple accounting decomposition. The first thing I want to convince you, though, is that little d, the wedge that the trade deficit puts between what US consumers demand for manufacturing output and what producers actually produce, it's pretty big. The sort of blue area is output, real output in US manufacturing. And then the red is domestic demand. And I'm defining domestic demand as basically just output plus manufacturing imports minus manufacturing exports. And so it is the manufacturing goods demand that sticks in the United States. I'm taking out exports because that's foreign, but I'm adding the imports in. And so this is the wedge that rising trade deficits are putting between demand and output. And you can see it's started to become big and it's grown significantly over the past couple of decades. And so if you just take that expression from before that had employment as a function of domestic demand, the wedge between output and demand, and productivity, you can actually get some numbers. And the numbers I looked at are between 1997 and 2016 for a couple of reasons, choosing these years. One, actually 1998 is the manufacturing employment peak in the US economy. And that's pretty striking because between 1997 and 2000, the US economy was roaring. Private sector employment rose by 10% over those 3 years. That is an extraordinarily fast growth rate, yet manufacturing employment declines. What's going on there in 1997, if those old enough to remember? It's the Asian currency crisis. We start to see really large trade deficits start to develop because of what's happening elsewhere in the world. And that's one reason to choose 1997, because that's when I would argue our modern era of really large trade deficits begins. And then two, data's much easier from 97 after in these series, so that's why I chose it. So if you look at hours, basically, people have shown this before, we see about a 34% decline in employment hours in manufacturing. Over the same period, though, we actually have domestic demand rising by 34% over this time period. There was actually relatively robust demand growth in that time. But the wedge between demand and output, that trade balance wedge, that knocks about 18 percentage points as a share of manufacturing output off of that. So that's domestic demand, US consumers wanting to buy washing machines and dining room tables and TVs, but it's not being satisfied by domestic production, it's being satisfied on net by foreign demand. That leaves us with output growth of just 16.4%, and then you get the productivity growth of 50% over that time period. So when people say productivity growth in manufacturing employment, they really mean the interplay between demand and productivity growth. Like, no one thinks that employment should have declined by 50%. They basically say productivity rose faster than demand, and so it's sort of the domestic influences. So those domestic influences, domestic demand growth minus productivity, that only explains about a little less than half of the total employment decline in manufacturing over that time. That wedge from the rising trade deficit explains about half. And so to my mind, just looking at this aggregate data, it is really hard to not see the rise in manufacturing trade deficits is really co-lead with what has happened to manufacturing employment over that time. And then final 10 seconds. So why did manufacturing trade deficits rise substantially over this time period? It's overwhelmingly misaligned exchange rates. The US economy still has a very overvalued dollar, did for a lot of that period. That should really be sort of the laser focus of people who are really concerned about the effect of manufacturing trade deficits on employment. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. And our final discussant was to be Professor Michael Hicks from Ball State University. He wasn't able to be here because of weather. Larry Michelle, former EPI president, is going to read Professor Hicks's prepared remarks. Thanks, Larry.
Thank you. Michael was concerned that the expected snow would allow him to get here but not to leave. And I guess he doesn't like Washington. Okay, I'm going to read his remarks and as supplemented by an email from him this morning. He starts out acknowledging the significant decline in factory employment. That's been very disruptive. And he writes, at the same time, both real GDP and real value-added production in U.S. manufacturing likely peaked in 2017, and absent business cycle disruptions have grown steadily across the historical horizon of data. Likewise, the United States has experienced negative net exports since 1980, and the balance of trade with China was roughly $350 billion in 2016. Given these data, a significant body of research has attempted to explain the causes and consequences of these employment changes. Dr. Hausman's paper offers a useful and concise restatement of much of this analysis. She does so, as her title suggests, in two parts, which I discuss in turn. The causation of job losses is an important ingredient to policy interventions. Despite common perception, data on employment, trade, and output suffer significant conceptual challenges. So such issues as domestic outsourcing of non-production tasks, imprecise trade data, or BLS adjustments for quality all affect conclusions which can be drawn from these data. Dr. Hausman explains much of the research on these issues, but there are two especially notable issues that merit comment. First, the limited work on BLS bias, some of which is not reported, suggests more symmetry than this review suggests. And just to summarize, he's saying, Sue says that there are studies which show that the BLS productivity is overstated. He's pointing out that he thinks there's studies that say it's understated. Second, Dr. Hausman corrects a common error by economists to two casually attributing productivity gains to simple automation. This was covered in her earlier work with Michael Mandel and in papers with Bartik and Sturgeon. More research on the sources of productivity improvements may uncover such diverse contributions as better education, changes in union strength, and robotics. My only real critique of this section is that I believe it overstates the disagreement regarding the relative contribution of trade and productivity reported in the literature. Part of the disagreement is tautological. There was a surprising consensus across several studies using different techniques that identify pure trade-related manufacturing job losses during the 2000s as between 750,000 and 1.5 million, or between about 10 to 30%. There's also agreement that some of the productivity-related job losses are motivated by competition induced by imports. So, do we call this a trade or productivity-related job loss? I think an important contribution of this work is to motivate economists and policymakers to talk more broadly about measurement issues. I do think that Dr. Hausman is right and that there is unlikely to be agreement on the figure, but I think there's less disagreement among researchers than appears in either the policy debate or in the media. The consequences of manufacturing job loss are, as in Dr. Hausman suggests, among the most robust findings in labor economics. In conclusion, Dr. Hausman has produced another important analysis of the puzzle regarding the effect of productivity and trade on manufacturing employment. I asked Dr. Hicks to expand his remarks in order to directly comment on one of the main issues that Sue raises, which is can we attribute the erosion of manufacturing employment to automation or to, rather than anything related to output-related matters or trade. And, okay. So here's what he says. While I concur that slow output growth is a contributor to lower levels of manufacturing employment growth, I don't think it is necessarily relevant to exclude computers from the discussion. Susan may be correct, there's a theme here. Susan may be correct that BLS weighting biases upward productivity growth, but a full accounting of its total effect on manufacturing would require conducting some of the same analysis for non-computer inputs. That was the point I attempted to make about earlier criticism of the BLS. Manufacturing goods are increasingly platforms for computing capacity that alter the value consumers receive from the product. That value likely exceeds the value of the products produced separately. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Larry. Thank you, Dr. Ball in absentia. Before we go to the audience, I'd like to give the panelists a little bit of a chance to go back and forth with each other. A couple of interesting issues have been raised here, and I think one of them in particular for Sue is whether it's arbitrary to exclude computers from the manufacturing output, and why it is that we make that choice and what that tells us. And invite Carolyn also to respond. Thanks.
Sure. Well, first, I want to make really clear.
I think. Is this on? Okay.
Okay, good. So I want to make really clear that I am not arguing that the adjustment of price deflators in the computer and electronics products industry is wrong. I'm not saying that productivity is biased, that the government estimates of productivity growth. There is a very robust debate within, the small corner of the economics profession that pays a lot of attention to price deflators, okay? And it is absolute, about whether these adjustments are too big or too little. And there is a very large debate going on right now about whether we should be more, better adjusting other sorts of products and services, goods and services, particularly IT goods and services, better for changes in product quality. My point, rather, is really twofold. One is that these productivity changes are not picking up automation. And too often in the public discussion, we're pretty sloppy about that. We're assuming that productivity growth is, implicitly or explicitly, we're very often assuming in this debate that productivity growth is picking up automation. It's not. Okay? And secondly, the reason I think it's useful to take out computers is because when you are looking at the manufacturing numbers, the trends are just so dominated by what's happening in that one industry that it's really hard to interpret. I think the statistical agencies will be moving increasingly towards a better adjustment for product quality. I think it's going to make things very difficult, more difficult for people to interpret the statistics in the way that they're used to interpreting them. So.
Carolyn, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I would just add that I think there tends to be a view when we talk about productivity growth and automation that we're saying the industry's losing jobs because these jobs were automated. I think that's part of it, but I think it's a small part. The point I'm making is the really big part is about price elasticities and income elasticities. They're just not big enough so that when productivity rises and prices come down, that people want so many more of these goods. And then if people want the same amount of these goods, or maybe a little bit more, and productivity's risen a ton, that's going to cost jobs. So it's not automation that's costing jobs. It's this relative price problem. And sort of structural change as well on top of that, which has led us to consume more services than goods. So I think that productivity still plays a really big role. In my mind, automation in combination with this relative productivity hypothesis is the lion's share. I still think trade, especially in this period, was probably, the 20 to 40% people want to allot it. I don't have a problem with that. and it is important. We do have to think about it. Like Josh, I think it has much more to do with the real exchange rate than trade policy. And then just on taking out one industry, why should I take out one industry? I have a whole set of data. Let's do that with all our data, take out one industry, and I can show you almost any correlation. So I do think it's problematic to take out one industry, or at least then let's talk about all industries, because there's some interesting things going on, as I mentioned, especially in transportation equipment, machinery, things that the U.S. is really good at producing that we should also focus on. So if we're going to take out one industry, let's at least look at all disaggregated data, not computers, everything else.
But Carolyn, do you agree that there's something unique about the
yeah,
computer
absolutely.
hedonic indices and the way we calculate price changes and quality changes, so that you have this kind of very small industry, which is actually in decline, and I think it is contributing to the counterintuitive sense, where I think a lot of Americans, certainly manufacturing employment and job and trade, was a huge issue in the 2016 presidential election and has been, a contributor to growing inequality and wage stagnation and the decline of a lot of communities, particularly in the Midwest. And so people have this sense, and then a lot of pundits come out and say, you're all wrong, you're all idiots. There's nothing wrong with manufacturing because manufacturing output is in fact growing, and there's nothing happening here except that you're all idiots. And there's no problem with trade because it's all automation. And so I think what Sue is trying to pull out is the idea that there's something actually strange that happens in the data, the adjustment that happens, which is, when you say, your computer this year has twice as much computing power as it had last year, and yet it costs pretty much the same or $10 more, then you all of a sudden have bought twice as many computers. So that what we see about the health of output of GDP, what we see about the growth and productivity is skewed by some necessary adjustments to computer prices and quantities, but that they are also misleading us when we try to think sensibly about what's actually happening.
No, I think that's a fair point. I would just say that I think we have to be careful then to do that in other industries as well. That doing that only with computers skews the discussion in one direction.
But Susan, does that fix the problem if you took out textile and apparel, for example?
No, I don't think that the other, the productivity growth in the other sectors isn't going to make that much difference in terms of to change the overall picture. What really changes the picture, and I have experimented with this, but it doesn't change the overall picture. In fact, another industry where there is a lot of quality adjustment is autos. I've tried taking out autos, but it just isn't enough to make a difference. Computers is, sui generis. It's unique among itself in sort of the magnitude of the changes. I want to, while I have the microphone, I did want to reply to one of Carolyn's other comments. And it is very common to say, well, this study, repeating what I said during my remarks, this study found 25%. Or that study found 30%. So the rest is probably automation. That's a problem. Right now, what you should be saying is, what was the technology shock that occurred in the early 2000s that caused a nearly 20% decline, now near 30% decline in employment? And people that have tried to look at that have come up short. Now, I emphasize that there's holes in the research. The debate's still open. But that's the question that you have to answer. It's not sort of saying, because research is slow, it's hard to kind of, as you know, Carolyn, it's hard to get sort of very convincing causal evidence. So it's looking at this effect of this trade policy on employment and so forth. So it's not complete. What needs to be done is for researchers to come up, if you really believe the automation story is going on, for some compelling evidence that there was a technology shock in the early 2000s that caused a collapse, and that was specific to manufacturing that caused that decline. And then just quickly, I completely agree with Carolyn. The trade, and I perhaps didn't make this as clear as I should have during my talk, we benefit a lot from trade,
Nobody's, at least not, I'm certainly not arguing for, throwing up walls at the border, okay? I think that what was really unique and special, or special isn't the right adjective, but what was really unique about the early 2000s was just the magnitude of the shock. I was trying to get at that in my discussion about dislocated workers. The size really matters, and we had a very large trade shock then. And that's where I think the problem is most serious. And it's that policies, whether it's exchange rates or anything else, that may have led to large, sudden shifts in the structure of global production that can be especially problematic for an economy.
I just wanted to add about this thing that, well, if it's not trade and we don't have this big productivity growth, then we have to come back to trade. That if you really look at the data and just the timing of when the job loss happened, it's one thing: recessions. So in recessions, that's when the job loss happens, and so then it goes back to the demand. The demand suddenly drops. You've been holding workers for a long time as productivity has been increasing, and then during the recession, you let those workers grow. So I don't think if we look at the timing of when they fall versus the technology and trade, it's the right way to look at it, because it's extraordinarily lumpy when that job loss happens. It wasn't a continuity over this period when China was increasing exports to the US. It was really two distinct periods when a lot of job loss happened that happened because of, holding too much labor, and then a recession hits, and that forces this readjustment.
Okay. Yeah, just on that point, because that's related to what I wanted to talk about. I think one way to think about this, the way I think about it anyway, is like productivity growth, as we've all shown, it's basically been on relatively the same pace for a long time. It is the background music to the manufacturing sector. And then what changes to cause sort of job losses is what's happening to output growth around that. And I think two things. Post-2000, you basically have a huge decline in output growth relative to sort of the trend and relative to productivity. And I think, one, there's the obvious answer of rising trade deficits. That is, put that big wedge between what U.S. consumers demanded and what U.S. factories produced. And then it's true, we've just had a very slow-growing macroeconomy since 2000. And I think that is, well, you've got the background music of productivity going pretty fast in manufacturing, and then you downshift the overall level of growth, you're going to run into some job problems in that sector. I think in regards to the lumpiness of job losses, though, I think there's two tells that it's not just about recessions per se. One, the evidence I talked about in my talk, we had a roaring economy from 97 to 2000 and zero manufacturing growth, actually a slight decline as trade deficits rise. After the 2001 recession, which was heavy in manufacturing but mild overall, we got none of those jobs back before the Great Recession hit. And we got none of them back because even as the overall economy grew and U.S. consumers started wanting to buy things again, they were much more likely to buy imports from China over that time. So I think on the one hand, yes, most of it happens during recessions, but the complete failure to mount any recovery at all in between those recessions, to me, is a big tell that sort of the trade deficits were a big player.
Thanks very much to all the panelists, and we do have time for some questions. We'd like to open to the audience. Please wait for the microphone, state your name and affiliation if you have one, and we'll take maybe 2 or 3 questions and then allow the panelists to respond. Robert Blecker in the back.
Hi, I'm Robert Blecker from American University, and in the interest of full disclosure, I'm an EPI research associate. So first of all, I would actually like to be a little heretical and challenge the idea that we have to accept the productivity numbers for computers. And I understand that, I'm not talking about the exact numbers, but to me, the way we measure variables should depend on the purpose of our analysis. So if we want to know, and I think Michael Hicks put it very well when he said, the value consumers receive from something like a laptop or your car, yes, we should do the hedonic adjustment. Of course, that computer is far more powerful than the ones we used to have. But if we want to know how productive are the workers in the factories who put the chips in and put it all together, or even the workers in the assembly line somewhere who make the chips, they're not actually making more chips or more laptops or more cars than they used to. It's just that the things they're plugging in because of knowledge increases and technological innovation are create more value for the consumer. But they're not, I would challenge the idea that in terms of productivity, that's really different. Second point relates to some of this conversation at the end. How do we account for the fact that there's this precipitous decline in the total amount of manufacturing manufacturing employment, and yet this continuous decline with no change in the trend in the share of manufacturing employment? And the answer has to do with something Josh was hinting at the end, the stagnation of the economy, secular stagnation since somewhere around 2000. If you look at the total number of jobs created in the US economy, from 1960 to 2000, it was about 2 million jobs a year. Since 2000, I haven't got the latest numbers, but it's well under 1 million. There was less than half of the annual rate of job creation overall. Now, why are we having this stagnation? Obviously, I don't have time to go into that. But the only reason that the ratio is doing the same thing when the numerator has gone off the charts is because the denominator is also not doing very well.
Bring it up here. Pat Malloy over here.
Thea, thank you for putting on this terrific program. I want to make 2 points. I was on the banking committee staff from 83 to 97, and I saw the movement from stakeholder to shareholder capitalism, which is, and there are 2 chapters in the book called The Golden Passport about the history of the Harvard Business School, which describes this phenomenon. The second thing, I was on the China Commission for 10 years and saw the movement of what happened once we got China in the WTO. Now, people say we didn't give China a different tariff after they were in, but what we did, we gave it to them permanently. In other words, we could always take MFN away from them until they came into the WTO. Without MFN, the average good would have faced a 42% tariff in the US. With MFN, it was probably lower than 4%. So that's the key thing. And then when our companies are driven by shareholder value to increase their profits for their shareholders, and the other countries are offering them subsidies, underpriced exchange rates, it's going to cost them. They're going to move your production from here to there. So I'm wondering, have you guys focused on shareholder capitalism as a problem or a factor in all of this that has happened to the American worker over the last 15 years, which has led to results in the last election?
Thanks, Pat. And Alan Tonelson, front row.
Hi, I'm Alan Tonelson, and I write the Reality Check blog, and thank you all for this great conference, and thank you all for these very high-quality exercises in economic analysis. And I've got one observation and then one suggestion that I hope you'll all react to. One, it's really a shame that it's all necessary. And I say that because you all agree that there are big data flaws here that you've got to try to work around and circumvent and try to explain. And yet there is a big body of data that is out there that could explain a great deal that no one looks at because there's no obligation on the part of the major players to make it publicly available. And what I mean by that is the major players, especially when it comes, to job offshoring, are of course for the American economy, U.S.-based multinational companies. They know exactly how many workers they've moved all around the world. They know exactly what they make because if they didn't have this information, they probably couldn't be profitable. So wouldn't it be great if every company in this country, at least above a certain size, had to report every year, how many jobs have you moved overseas? How many jobs back? We do have actually, of course, Labor Department data that tells us how many workers have lost jobs from foreign competition. But we've got flaws there too because a lot of the folks who lose jobs don't know that they have this option, which leads down the road to various various retraining programs. So it would be great if all the organizations up here and everybody else who studies trade policy started pressing Washington to force multinational companies to release this data, and then we could actually know what's happening rather than have to engage in all of this very sophisticated but ultimately unsatisfying economic analysis.
Thank you, Alan. We have one more quick question, and then we'll allow the panelists. I'm sorry, I just want to squeeze it in.
Quick question, but a sort of large one. My name is Carolina Young. I'm a new APSA congressional fellow in Senator Mark Warner's office. I believe our office has been very concerned about future of work and supporting workers in the manufacturing industry in particular. And so one of the questions that I had for the panel was sort of policy recommendations for the future of manufacturing in particular. There are lots of policy recommendations that are, that are part of this debate in terms of wage stagnation, in terms of exchange rates, in terms of all sorts of things, upskilling for workers in particular. So I'd love for the panel to talk about those different things. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. That's a great last question. And with that, I'd like to allow the panel, starting with Sue, going down the road here, to respond to all four of those questions, which were all excellent. Thank you.
Okay, so first on Robert's a question about computers and should this productivity growth really show up somehow in the manufacturing sector. Not to publicize my own work, but I've actually argued in an article with Tim Bartik and Tim Sturgeon at MIT, my colleague Tim Bartik at the Upjohn Institute, that probably the great productivity growth in computers is to a large degree being driven by research and development. And that probably should be not booked to productivity, to manufacturing rather. The problem is that we're not, we don't know how to adjust yet services prices to book that productivity growth to the services industry. It's really a huge challenge. It's way beyond the scope of this. But bottom line, I would agree. We don't really know how to develop reasonable measures for R&D services. Interestingly, as production in these sectors is moving overseas, and you get perhaps some of the R&D staying here, you may see it showing up less and less as productivity growth in the U.S. economy, simply because we don't sort of measure it very well, that productivity growth, that improvements to products coming out of R&D. I do agree with very much with Pat Malloy's comments about kind of the change in the way corporations are run, the movement from stakeholder to shareholder value that has, certainly had a big effect, and the pressure on companies, which is very real, to increase margins, maximize profits, is perhaps and almost certainly to some degree pushed companies to shift more quickly overseas to increase margins than one would have seen in the past. I think it's an important phenomenon. Some people are looking at it, but it's arguably understudied. Alan, I always favor more and better data. And I actually do think that kind of the globalization of things has just made it harder to measure stuff, and we need to think more broadly about collecting better data to better understand the competitiveness of domestic manufacturing and other industries. We sort of need to rethink the architecture of our statistical system in that way. Finally, Carolina from Mark Warner's office, policies, wow, there's a whole host, and I think that my colleagues will have more to say about that. But certainly, there's a host of macro policies. I think there's broad agreement that an appreciation or overvalued exchange rates is a huge problem, and we should be cautious about that happening, allowing that to happen in the future.
and as Josh has argued, perhaps are still overvalued, but I'm going to stay out of that debate. In terms of the nitty-gritty, there's certainly a lot of very good vocational training programs and the like that can make a big difference for the skills of workers in manufacturing. There's a big demand for that. And I think this sort of vocational education should be expanded.
Great questions. Let me start with the PNTR one, because I really fundamentally disagree with that view that PNTR had a big effect. Before China was granted PNTR, there was no time when it reverted once it got, preferential or the MFN status. We never reverted away from that. So what's to make us think we would have? And we did have two really important tools, which we still use, which the U.S. still uses today, which are, anti-dumping and countervailing duties, which were used very heavily against China. So I think that there were policies in place. But let me turn to research on the topic. There's a great new paper by Mary Amiti, John Romales, Rob Feenstra, and one other person. And what it shows is that it wasn't about anything other countries granted China. To the extent you want to argue it was WTO accession, it was China's own liberalization. So the fact that all of a sudden in China you had access to cheaper intermediates and you could enter into global supply chains and all this had a much bigger effect on China's export growth than anything other countries granted. So we pushed China to liberalize, but remember that some of that liberalization is going to improve their own productivity. So it was reforms China made that really had the biggest impact. In terms of policy recommendations, before I went on leave from the Institute, Chad Bown and I were working on 2 policy briefs exactly on this question, and one looks at the decline in U.S. labor force participation compared to other countries and tries to understand. The other one looks at lessons from other countries on labor market policies, because while other countries had very similar experiences overall in terms of GDP growth, in terms of declining manufacturing, what they didn't have was some of the declining labor force participation that the U.S. had. And why is that? And one, we spend a lot less on labor market policies than other countries in the OECD, in particular, job placement policies, training. But that's not going to be enough if there's really a structural change and demand fell. So then you need to turn to policies like wage insurance, potentially public works, though I visited the Hoover Dam over the holidays and was amazed that, it was finished 2 years early and employed all these people at a time of great difficulty. So I think given the state of infrastructure in this country, there is a way to boost demand through infrastructure, and then on top of that have these policies for labor that could do a lot. And then finally, just to say that if we really think, it's about, and I think most people do, that the trade deficit, when we're not at full employment, is going to be making it more difficult for workers. I think there's research by Joe Gagnon and others showing that fiscal policy is important. So if you're going to run a fiscal deficit, that means the government's consuming more than it has in revenues, than its production, and some of that is going to go to imports, and so that's going to pull the deficit. And so forth. So why don't I stop there? But those were great questions. Thank you.
Yeah, so I'll say a couple words on policy first, because that is a very, very long discussion. And so just the headlines. I mean, if you're really worried on sort of the narrower issue, and it's a big issue, but it's narrower relative to all the other problems in the American economy of manufacturing employment, to my mind, dealing with misaligned exchange rates is the really key one, and dealing with them in a way that's credible in the long run. I mean, it's one thing to say, we should make the dollar go down for a couple of years. That won't do a lot. I mean, there needs to be real credibility that the U.S. is now committed to never again allowing the dollar to just annihilate the U.S. manufacturing sector. And that means doing something like we've got a Federal Reserve that monitors this one really important macroeconomic price that is the interest rate. And we say that is your job to adjust it depending on economic conditions. It seems to me we should probably have something like that for the exchange rate. It's an extraordinarily important macroeconomic price, and that's one we disallow to whipsaw around and cause a lot of damage, and it's not clear to me why we do that. And so I think big picture ideas on how to credibly commit to never allowing the dollar to really do what it did to manufacturing again is a big part of the story there. I would also agree, I think infrastructure investment would be really key for a couple reasons. One, I think we need it. I think we've underinvested in it for a long time. I think we still have some slack to be wrung out of the economy that it would do. And it's particularly good for manufacturing. It buys a lot of inputs from the manufacturing sector, so I think that would be a very good thing. I think turning to Pat's point for a second about, these policies are sensible enough, why haven't they happened? I think his point is really interesting because it reminds us that most trade policy, if you think of it as a U.S. v. China or U.S. v. Mexico, you will get it wrong every time. I mean, trade policy is about people within the United States and people within China and within Mexico and how the interests collide. And to be really clear on this, everyone agrees that the Chinese government was managing the value of their currency for competitive gain in the early 2000s, and many people may have been like, why is the U.S. allowing that to happen? Well, which U.S.? I mean, Walmart loves this. Yeah. Walmart gets really cheap imports from this policy. And so the fact that manufacturing workers in some states are getting hammered and Walmart likes it, well, who do you think wins that policy debate most of the time? And so I think that the really key thing I take from Pat's comment is exactly that. These are not nations versus nations conflicts. These are really class-based conflicts within nations. That's the way you need to look at this stuff.
That's a great note on which to end. I'd like you to please join me in thanking our panelists and thank you all for coming out today, and I hope this will be just the beginning of an ongoing conversation about policy in the important area of trade, automation, manufacturing, and the future of work. Thank you very much. Thanks to C-SPAN, and hope to see you again soon.
Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. I enjoyed reading your paper and your earlier work as well.
Pardon?
And your earlier work on this topic as well.